Close your eyes and imagine yourself in a distant land on a morning centuries ago. The sun, rising from behind misty mountains, shines upon an as-yet unshaped destiny. This is Japan, a land where the archipelago is battered by fierce winds, where nature is both incredibly generous and incredibly cruel. The concept of the samurai, now a worldwide legend, sprouted on these misty slopes, born from the necessity of protecting the land. Towards the end of the 8th century, Japan was not yet fully under the control of a central authority. While the silk-clad aristocrats of the capital, Nara, and later Kyoto, Heian-kyo, wrote poetry and gazed at cherry blossoms in the palace gardens, life in the countryside was much harsher. Landowners had to form their own armies to protect their properties from bandits and rival clans. The verb saburao, meaning to serve, from which the word samurai originates, was born from this need for loyalty and protection. Initially, they were merely professional guards, watchmen who accompanied their masters like shadows. Over time, these servants evolved from mere sword-wielding men to developing a class consciousness. In the wild steppes of eastern Japan, these warriors who had mastered archery from horseback lived in harmony with nature. A samurai's first virtue was to withstand the harsh natural conditions and to be bound by absolute loyalty. Imagine, my friend, on one side the delicate music of the palace, and on the other the footsteps of a class forged in steel and sweat across the vast fields. At this time, samurai did not yet possess the magnificent armor we know today. They wore cruder protection made of a combination of leather and iron plates. But something was growing within them, a sense of honor. For a samurai, living was not merely breathing, but serving a purpose. If there was no purpose to serve, the warrior's existence lost its meaning. They were the first soldiers, amidst the chaotic birth pangs of Japan, to establish order with the tip of their swords. Now listen to the silence of these ancient lands. You can hear the first warrior oaths whispered by the wind through the trees. As the samurai class prepared to take power from the elegant but weak hands of the aristocracy, Japan's destiny was about to change forever. This was not just the beginning of a military class, but the unnamed first steps of a philosophy of life, Bushido. As the sun set, giving way to the silvery light of the moon, a single thought echoed in the minds of these warriors: serve and remain with honor. Tomorrow, we will discover the unwritten laws that shaped this honor, the mysterious philosophy that made a samurai fearless of death. Bushido. For now, you can drift off to a peaceful sleep, imagining the coolness of those distant mountains and the dignified stance of the first samurai. As night falls, transport your mind to a samurai's chamber, to the peaceful silence where a dim candle flickers. Outside, the wind rustles through bamboo groves. Inside, a warrior disciplines not only his body, but also his soul. What distinguishes a samurai from an ordinary soldier is not the steel at his waist, but the unwritten law in his heart. Bushido, the way of the warrior. Bushido was not a set of laws written in ink on paper. It was a way of life, passed down from father to son, from master to apprentice, through breath and example. At the heart of this philosophy lie 7 great virtues. Listen, for these virtues are the compass not only of a warrior, but of a virtuous person. First, gi, truthfulness. For a samurai, there are no gray areas. Something is either right or wrong. Decision-making must be as sharp and clear as drawing a sword from its sheath. Then comes rei, respect.
A samurai shows kindness even to his most formidable enemy, because a warrior who loses his courtesy is no different from an animal. A samurai's strength lies in the respect he has for others.
And what about courage? According to Bushido, courage is not blindly rushing into danger, but recognizing fear and doing what is right despite it. This courage brings with it the concept of meo, honor. Honor is a samurai's most precious treasure. Lost lands can be reclaimed, broken bones can heal, but a tarnished honor can only be cleansed by sacrificing one's life. Now imagine within this disciplined life, for a samurai, death is not an end, but a completion. Chugi, loyalty, his devotion to his master and his cause, makes him fearless of the cold breath of death. The path, say the ancients, begins each morning by accepting death. A samurai is ready to wither in the springtime of his life like cherry blossoms falling from the branch at their most beautiful. Therefore, he lives every moment, every cup of tea, every sunset with the grace of if it were his last. This philosophy blends the faithfulness of Confucianism with the respect for nature of Shintoism. The samurai wields his sword not merely to destroy, but to maintain order and ensure justice. His spirit is like the calm surface of a lake. It ripples when a stone is thrown into it, but then returns to its perfect stillness. Close your eyes and consider how these 7 virtues form an armor in the soul of a samurai. For them, the real battle is not on the battlefield, but this inner struggle against their own ego. Tomorrow, we will talk about the katana, the legendary object in which this spirit takes flesh and blood, the samurai's most loyal friend and mirror of his soul, and its sacred story of forging. Imagine entering a blacksmith's workshop in the darkness of midnight, illuminated only by the growling of the bellows and the reddish flame of the forge. This is not just a craft house, it is a temple. For a samurai, the sword is far more than a weapon carried at his waist. It is a part of the samurai's soul, the physical manifestation of his honor. In early Japan, swords were straight and heavy, but over time they evolved to suit the needs of the samurai on the battlefield, transforming into the curved, elegant, and deadly katana form we know today. But this transformation was not merely a technical advancement, but a mystical event. The katana-making process begins with months of patient and devotional ritual. Before beginning work, the master blacksmith performs purification rituals, dons his sacred garments, and takes his place at the forge. The steel used is a rare ore called tamagane, obtained through a firing process that lasts for weeks. This steel is folded repeatedly. Imagine, with each strike of the blacksmith's hammer, the steel doubles, is forged and folded again. This structure, composed of thousands of layers, gives the sword both incredible hardness and a flexibility that prevents it from breaking. During this process, the blacksmith believes he breathes a soul into the sword with each hammer blow. The sharp edge, of the sword is made of hard steel, while the shaft, mune, is made of softer steel to absorb the blows. This combination of contrasts reflects the samurai's character, sharp and hard against the enemy, flexible and protective towards loved ones and his master. The greatest masters in history, such as Masamune and Muramasa, didn't just make swords, they created legends. Legend says that when a sword made by Masamune was dipped into a river, leaves carried by the current would pass by, avoiding its sharpness, for the sword was so sacred and peaceful that it did not want to cause unnecessary pain. On the other hand, Muramasa's swords were bloodthirsty. They would never return to their scabbards without seeing blood. These stories are proof that the katana was seen not merely as an object, but as a living entity. As the samurai class rose, Only they were granted the right to carry a sword. When a samurai was born, a sword was brought to his chambers. When he died, it was placed beside him. Even the smallest speck of dust falling on the katana was considered a stain on the samurai's honor. The clanging of scabbards in the street, saya-ate, was a cause for a duel because the sword meant touching the samurai's soul. As events unfolded, these swords ceased to be mere ceremonial objects and played a leading role in battles that changed the course of history. In those bloody periods of transition from mounted archery to infantry warfare, the speed with which the katana swept through armor and took lives with a single swing was the element that made the samurai invincible. When a samurai drew his sword, he erased all thoughts from his mind. He entered a state of mushin, or mindlessness, becoming one with the sword. Now what he holds in his hand is no longer just metal, but an extension of his arm, the sharp edge of his will. Now hear the dying embers of the forge and the sound of the cooling steel. That discipline in the forging of a sword permeates every moment of the samurai's life. Like steel forged with patience, tested by fire, and finally shining, the samurai matures through pain and training. Tomorrow we will witness the first great test of these swords and bows, the wild Emishi Expeditions in northern Japan, and the ferocious birth of mounted archery. May the silver gleam of the katana illuminate your dreams.
Close your eyes and imagine yourself in the late 8th century, in the dark, dense forests and rugged mountains of Honshu in northern Japan. The word samurai hadn't yet fully taken root, yet this wild landscape laid the foundation for the world's most disciplined warrior class. The Japanese Empire sought to expand its borders northward, but faced an indomitable people, the Emishi. This indigenous population were warriors who spoke the language of the jungle, mastered ambushes, and had mastered guerrilla warfare. The empire's heavy and cumbersome infantry armies were routed by the Emishi arrows in these impenetrable forests. It was at this point that the military revolution that changed the course of history occurred. The empire realized it needed small, elite units as swift and horse-riding as the Emishi to replace its cumbersome armies. This need gave birth to the philosophy of Kyuba no Michi, the way of the horse and the bow, the ancestor of the samurai. Initially, the samurai were less swordsmen and more archers who, galloping on horseback, could hit their targets with pinpoint accuracy. This was a tremendous art of balance, requiring not just brute force, but a one-mind unity between the warrior and his horse. Events ignited when Emperor Kamu moved the capital to Kyoto in 794 and subsequently launched major campaigns north. Leading these campaigns was Sakanui no Tamuramaro, one of history's first great generals. Tamuramaro was one of the first to receive the title Sei Tai Shogun, Great General who subdued the barbarians. Under his leadership, a new generation of mounted warriors plunged into Emishi. Imagine the silence of a misty morning, broken only by the rhythmic sound of thousands of horses pounding the earth. The samurai rose on their horses, drew their bows, and unleashed that deadly rain of arrows they called yakubari. This was not just a battle, but a struggle for survival.
During these campaigns, the samurai's famous armor, the O-yoroi, began to take shape. Designed to leave the archer's right arm free while protecting his left from incoming arrows, this heavy, colorful armor transformed the warrior into a tank. But the heart beating beneath this armor was bound not only to the emperor, but also to the honor of his own clan. The Emishi Wars revealed the weakness of the central army, demonstrating the value of local power and family ties.
The samurai was no longer a mere government official, but a warrior defending his land and honor with his blood. Towards the end of the war, with the surrender of the Emishi leader Aterui, the North was tamed. However, the wild spirit born in this process was sealed into the heart of Japan. Now, the way of the warrior was not just a defensive strategy, but a social identity. The samurai were emerging from the depths of the forests, preparing to enter Japan's political arena. The strings of the bows drawn on horseback were playing the first tunes of future shogunates and bloody clan wars. Now feel the coolness of that distant northern wind on your skin. The neighing of horses and the high-pitched whistling of arrows in the air are slowly fading. The first samurai conquered the wilderness, but the real test was yet to come. The intrigues of the court, and the ambition that wealth brought. Tomorrow we will discover the steel will beneath the silk robes, the shadows of the magnificent Heian Palace, where the transition from aristocracy to military dictatorship began.
Take your mind beyond time to 10th and 11th century Kyoto, then known as Heian-kyo, capital of peace and tranquility. This was the place where the world's most elegant, aesthetic, and perhaps most detached court life was lived. Aristocrats spent their time with poetry contests, incense games, and musical feasts under the moonlight. But while this silk-clad kuge class wept over the falling cherry blossoms in the palace gardens, in the provinces far from the capital, life was turning blood red. The courtiers in the capital, considering the cultivation of land or the collection of taxes as dirty work, had delegated these tasks to powerful families in the provinces. This set the stage for one of history's greatest power shifts. Local families, holding the authority to collect taxes and armed to maintain order, gradually built their own armies and networks of loyalists. There was no longer an imperial army. Only the private armies of the clans existed. At the forefront of these clans rose two giants, Taira, or Heike, and Minamoto, or Genji. Events erupted when power struggles within the palace spilled into the streets. Unable to agree amongst themselves, the aristocrats called upon these provincial warriors, whom they considered crude and ignorant, for help. The Hogen Revolt of 1156 marked a turning point. The palace corridors were now filled with the clash of swords, replacing poetry. An ambitious leader named Taira no Kiyomori recognized this weakness of the aristocracy. Kiyomori was not only a warrior, but also a cunning politician. He quickly infiltrated the palace, married his daughters into the imperial family, and rose to the top of the state as a member of the samurai class. However, there was a problem. As the samurai became more courtly, they were losing the harsh military discipline from which they derived their original power. While the Taira clan immersed themselves in the luxury, silk robes, and sophisticated entertainment of Kyoto, their rivals, the Minamoto clan, were forging a fire of revenge in the snowy mountains and harsh steppes where they had been exiled. Minamoto no Yoritomo and his legendary brother Yoshitsune, breathing in the cold winds on horseback, kept the true samurai spirit alive.
This was a transitional period where the pen was defeated by the sword and elegance gave way to absolute power. The aristocrats thought they could use the samurai like hunting dogs, but they would soon realize that the dogs were now wolves and had broken their chains. Power was no longer in the palace gardens, but in the horse-riding arenas and the forges where swords were forged. Imagine the lamplight seeping through the paper doors, shoji, of that distant Heian palace in the silence of the night. That light represents the last tremors of a dying aristocracy. In the darkness outside, the footsteps of thousands of samurai can be heard. Japan is heading towards the bloodiest and most epic civil war in its history, the infamous Genpei War between the Taira and Minamoto clans. Tomorrow, we will learn how these two giant clans tried to destroy each other on land and sea, and how the first shogunate was established. Now, drift off to sleep peacefully, feeling the tension between the rustling of silks and the creaking of steel armor.
Imagine the night in the incense-scented silence of a dimly lit temple. Outside, the world may be burning, armies may be clashing, but inside, a samurai sits motionless, cross-legged on a stone floor. This posture is zazen. For the samurai, Zen is not just a religion, but a mental technology that enables him to survive on the battlefield and, more importantly, to die with honor. Zen Buddhism, arriving in Japan from China around the end of the 12th century, spread like wildfire among the samurai class. Why? Because Zen is not concerned with complex theories or thick books. Zen is concerned with direct action, absolute focus, and the annihilation of the self. For a samurai, the battlefield is a place where decisions must be made in seconds. If thoughts like, "Will I die? Will my sword cut? What will my family do?" crowd his mind, he hesitates. Hesitation is death. Zen taught the samurai mushin, or mindlessness. Imagine, during a fight, the mind is like a mirror reflecting everything that falls upon it, but holding nothing. The mind is not present as the sword swings. The sword and the arm become one. The movement flows spontaneously. When the samurai understands that death is not an end, but an inevitable cycle of nature, fear loses its power over him. Zen masters would give samurai this crucial lesson. If you accept death as a part of life, no enemy can defeat you.
As events unfolded, Zen's influence was not limited to warfare. The samurai's daily discipline, aesthetic sense, and courtesy were also shaped by this philosophy. Everything from the tea ceremony to the art of flower arrangement became a form of meditation. Why is a warrior so meticulous when holding a delicate teacup? Because that moment is the only moment in the world. Zen taught him to cleanse himself of past regrets and future anxieties, to exist fully in the now. A samurai story goes, one day a samurai asks a Zen master what heaven and hell are. The master insults the samurai, calling him a filthy soldier. The samurai, enraged, draws his sword and is about to decapitate the master when the master calmly whispers, "This is the gate to hell." The samurai stops, sheathes his sword, and bows respectfully. The master smiles. This is the gate to heaven. Zen thus teaches the samurai that his greatest enemy is not his external rivals, but his own uncontrolled anger and ego. Now feel that profound silence in your mind, the inhalation and exhalation of your breath. A samurai, through this breath discipline, slows the beating of his heart, sharpens his senses. This spiritual preparation prepared them for the great storms to come, clan wars, Mongol invasions, and the bloody birth of the shogunates. Tomorrow, we will travel to one of the greatest showdowns in Japanese history, the legendary Genpei War between the Taira and Minamoto clans, where this inner silence gave way to the cries of war. Be prepared for that great tragedy, where the seas were stained with blood and honor was held above all else. May your mind be as calm as a lake and your sleep as peaceful as a child's. Imagine the night, accompanied by the sound of the fierce waves crashing against the shores of Japan. The year is 1180. Japan is being drawn into the most dramatic and decisive civil war in its history, the Genpei War. This is not merely a feud between two families. It is the death of the old world, aristocracy, and the birth pangs of the new world, samurai dominance. On one side, the magnificent Taira, Heikei clan with their red banners. On the other, the vengeful Minamoto, Genji clan with their white banners. Events spiral completely out of control with the death of Kiyomori, the leader of the Taira clan. The Minamoto clan begins to pour forth like a flood from the mountains and distant prefectures where they had been exiled for years. The war has two great heroes, the strategic genius Minamoto no Yoritomo and his legendary, brilliant warrior brother Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune is like the first true superhero in samurai history. He is the one who crosses cliffs on his horse and accomplishes raids deemed impossible. One of the most crucial scenes of the war is the Battle of Dan no Ura. Imagine hundreds of warships colliding in the narrow waters of the Shimonoseki Strait. Arrows darken the sky, and the sea is stained crimson with the red armor and blood of the Taira soldiers. The Taira clan is cornered. Rather than fall captive to the enemy, the women and aristocrats of the clan, taking the young Emperor Antoku with them, throw themselves into the depths of the sea. This is the tragic and honorable end of an era.
The Genpei War gifted samurai culture with the famous lion-hearted but tragic hero figure. Traditions such as shouting the name of one's opponent on the battlefield and challenging them to a duel, and honorably taking one's own life when one realizes one is about to lose, were cemented during this period. However, victory came at a great price. When the war ended, Yoshitsune was seen as a threat by his own older brother, Yoritomo, and was betrayed. Brother turned against brother. The cold, pragmatic reality of the samurai world revealed itself. Power sometimes outweighed loyalty. At the end of this war, the Taira clan was completely wiped out, but their spirit lived on in folklore. Japanese fishermen still believed that the crabs, heikegani, caught in those waters, with patterns on their backs resembling human faces, carry the souls of the drowned Taira warriors. The samurai were no longer merely protectors, but the absolute rulers of the land. Now, hear the wind in that narrow strait and the roar of the waves crashing against the shore. The war is over, the sea is calm, but Japan is no longer the old Japan. The sword has triumphed over the emperor's brush. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in the late 8th century, in the dark, dense forests and rugged mountains of Honshu in northern Japan. The word samurai hadn't yet fully taken root, yet this wild landscape laid the foundation for the world's most disciplined warrior class. The Japanese Empire sought to expand its borders northward, but faced an indomitable people, the Emishi. This indigenous population were warriors who spoke the language of the jungle, mastered ambushes, and had mastered guerrilla warfare. The empire's heavy and cumbersome infantry armies were routed by the Emishi arrows in these impenetrable forests. It was at this point that the military revolution that changed the course of history occurred. The empire realized it needed small, elite units as swift and horse-riding as the Emishi to replace its cumbersome armies. This need gave birth to the philosophy of Kyuba no Michi, the way of the horse and the bow, the ancestor of the samurai. Initially, the samurai were less swordsmen and more archers who, galloping on horseback, could hit their targets with pinpoint accuracy. This was a tremendous art of balance, requiring not just brute force, but a one-mind unity between the warrior and his horse. Events ignited when Emperor Kamu moved the capital to Kyoto in 794 and subsequently launched major campaigns north. Leading these campaigns was Sakanui no Tamuramaro, one of history's first great generals. Tamuramaro was one of the first to receive the title Sei Tai Shogun,
great general who subdued the barbarians. Under his leadership, a new generation of mounted warriors plunged into Emishi. Imagine the silence of a misty morning, broken only by the rhythmic sound of thousands of horses pounding the earth. The samurai rose on their horses, drew their bows, and unleashed that deadly rain of arrows they called yakubari. This was not just a battle, but a struggle for survival.
The Kamakura period was also a time when samurai aesthetics simplified. Complex court rituals were replaced by the simplicity of Zen Buddhism and the practicality of the warrior. In the sculptures and paintings of this period, you can see that determined, sometimes weary, but dignified expression on the faces of the warriors. The samurai had ceased to be a servant and had transformed into a warrior of honor at the highest level of society. However, the peace would not last long. After Yoritomo's death, power passed to his wife Masako's family, the Hojo clan. Masako was a powerful woman known as the priestess shogun and ruled Japan from behind the scenes with an iron fist. While Japan was grappling with internal strife during the Hojo clan's rule, an unimaginable threat began to emerge across the sea. Kublai Khan, lord of the distant steppes, had his eyes set on these small islands where the sun rose. The samurai, setting aside their petty squabbles, were about to face the greatest test in history against a threat of national annihilation. When the calendars showed the years 1274 and 1281, the shores of Japan faced the most terrifying spectacle in its history. Thousands of Mongol ships appeared on the horizon, carrying an unstoppable force that had until then conquered the world. The Mongols arrived with gunpowder, disciplined armies moving en masse, and massive siege machines. Yet the samurai still believed in the tradition of one-on-one duels, shouting their names and challenging their opponents to an honorable fight when they entered the battlefield. The Mongols simply laughed at this, showering the samurai with arrows and annihilating them en masse. The first encounters were a complete shock for the samurai. Traditional methods of warfare were helpless against this savage and massive invasion. The samurai fought tooth and nail on the beaches. In Hakata Bay, they raided the massive Mongol ships at night in small boats, climbing aboard and showcasing their mastery of close combat. It was like the struggle of ants attacking the feet of a giant. Japan was on the verge of falling. It was in those desperate moments that nature intervened. Believed to be the answer to days of prayers by the Japanese people and priests, a massive typhoon swept through the sea. The Japanese called it kamikaze, or holy wind. The Mongol fleet was annihilated by these giant waves. Thousands of soldiers perished. This miraculous salvation led the samurai and the Japanese people to see themselves as a nation protected by the gods.
However, the end of the war was the beginning of the end for the Kamakura shogunate. Traditionally, samurai were rewarded with a share of the conquered lands after a battle. But this time, there was no conquered land, only an invasion had been repelled. The shogunate could not find a reward to give to the thousands of samurai who had guarded the coast for years and spent their fortunes in this cause. Disappointed, mired in debt, and feeling unrewarded for their honor, the samurai began to question their loyalty. The holy wind had swept away the enemy, but it had also shaken the foundations of the shogunate. Japan was sliding into a darker internal reckoning where the price of loyalty was paid with blood and land. The Kamakura shogunate's failure to reward Mongol warriors created a wave of unrest throughout Japan. The samurai were in debt, and although their swords did not rust, their hopes were fading.
Realizing this gap, Emperor Go-Daigo hatched a secret plan to take back power from the samurai and move it back to the palace. But this was a suicidal gamble against a huge military force. At this point, Kusunoki Masashige, who will be known as the symbol of loyalty in samurai history, appeared on the scene. Masashige was not a feudal lord with large armies. He was a mountain warrior who was a genius of strategy. When he answered the emperor's call, he knew it was a hopeless cause. But the unshakable principle of Bushido echoed in his mind. Even if your master is wrong, your loyalty to him is your honor. Masashige held off the shogunate's massive armies for months with his small number of soldiers in Chihaya Castle. He stunned the enemy by rolling giant logs down from the castle and using fake soldier models. His resistance encouraged other clans as well.
But fortunes turned. Ashigaka Takauji, who left the ranks of the shogunate, first sided with the emperor and then betrayed him due to his ambition, began to march towards Kyoto with a large army. The emperor gave Masashige a strategically impossible and militarily suicidal mission: to meet Ashigaka's massive army in the open field. Masashige knew that this was certain death. He proposed to the emperor to retreat and wage a guerrilla war, but the courtiers wanted an honorable pitched battle. In 1336, on the banks of the Minato River, Masashige drew his sword for the last time. He fought until the last moment against the enemy army, which was 10 times superior in number, with a few hundred loyal soldiers at his side. When his body was filled with arrows and he could no longer fight, he retreated into a house with his brother. There they asked each other, "What do you want to be in your next life?" "I wish to be born into this world 7 more times to destroy the emperor's enemies," his brother said. Masashige accepted with a smile, and together they committed seppuku, harakiri, and ended their lives. The story of Kusunoki Masashige is a high point for the samurai ideal. He chose to die not for a war he would win, but for a cause he believed was right and remained loyal to. His sacrifice would be described as the greatest example of honesty and unwavering loyalty in Japan for centuries.
Transport your mind to the late 14th century, to the heart of Kyoto, to the magnificent yet melancholic palaces of the Muromachi district. The Ashikaga shogunate was perhaps the most contradictory period in Japan's history. On the one hand, the country was seething with wars, large and small, while on the other, the samurai class was undergoing the greatest cultural refinement in its history. The ideal samurai was no longer just a rough soldier specializing in the path of horse and bow, Kyuba no Michi. He also had to be a refined intellectual, knowledgeable in poetry, able to see the philosophy in the curves of a teacup. This was the birth of the Bunbu Ryodo ideal, where the concepts of Bun, literature, and Bu, military arts, were united in one body. The Ashikaga shoguns, especially Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who commissioned the Golden Pavilion, Kinkakuji, saw themselves as the new heirs to the court aristocracy. Kyoto became the most brilliant cultural center of East Asia during this period. Imagine, while tensions between clans escalated outside, inside, a samurai was creating an ink painting, sumie, in a garden imbued with the simplicity of Zen Buddhism. Depicting a mountain or a bamboo branch with a single brushstroke symbolized the absolute focus in the warrior's mind and the desire to purge everything unnecessary. These works of art reflected the samurai's famous sense of transience, mono no aware, stemming from his constant preoccupation with death.
Transport your imagination to that fateful spring morning in 1467, to Kyoto, the heart of Japan.
Until then, Kyoto was the most refined city in the world, the pinnacle of art and aesthetics. But the weak will of the Ashikaga shogunate, combined with the unbridled ambition of the local daimyo, feudal lords, transformed this elegance into hell with a single spark. The Onin War, while seemingly a simple struggle for succession, was in reality an explosion of tension that had accumulated in the soul of Japan for centuries. Two powerful families, the Hosokawa and Yamana clans, clashed in the heart of the capital, not only to determine the shogun's successor, but to become the absolute rulers of the country. Imagine, on one side, palaces inhabited by aristocrats in silk robes. On the other, thousands of armored samurai fighting street by street, house by house. This war was unlike the old honorable battles fought in open fields. Kyoto's narrow, winding streets became the scene of one of the most brutal guerrilla wars history has ever seen. The authority of the Ashikaga shogunate was so utterly shattered that when they looked out of the palace windows, all they could see were burning temples and rising smoke, yet they had no power to stop it. This decade-long destruction gave birth to a concept that would fundamentally alter samurai honor, Bushido, and Japanese social order, Gekokujo.
Gekokujo, literally meaning the underdog overthrowing the underdog, became a way of life during the Onin War. Low-ranking warriors, once devoted to their masters at all costs, began to kill them and seize their lands amidst the chaos. Loyalty was no longer an unshakable rock, but a leaf tossed about in the wind. During the decade of the war, Kyoto was systematically destroyed. Neighborhoods once filled with priceless works of art, manuscripts, and sacred shrines were now mere ruins of burnt wood and unclaimed corpses. Aristocrats were forced to sell their clothes and jewelry to peasants for a morsel of food to avoid starvation. The course of events also changed the identity of the samurai class. It was no longer enough to simply be a warrior. Survival depended on being the most ruthless and cunning. Ambushes, night raids, and using civilians as shields became commonplace. When the war ended, all that remained of Kyoto were sooty walls and ashes. But the real tragedy began not with the end of the war, but with its effects spreading throughout the countryside. The existence of a central government that could not protect its capital had become meaningless. Local lords, completely ignoring the shogun, began fortifying their own castles, building their own armies, and seizing the lands of their neighbors.
Among the ashes of the Onin War, the path was paved to the century-long bloodbath that Japan called the Warring States, Sengoku Jidai. Now, neither laws nor ancient traditions could protect anyone. The only currency was the sharpness of the katana at the waist and the mind's skill in treacherous games. The samurai spirit had emerged from those elegant tea rooms and plunged into a dark forest where savagery and betrayal reigned. Now imagine the orange flames covering the sky of that burning city and the cries heard at night. Japan had now embarked on an irreversible path. After the Onin War, Japan was no longer a single country, but a den of wolves divided into hundreds of pieces, ready to devour each other. This period is what we call the Sengoku Jidai, or Warring States period. This century of chaos, lasting from 1467 to 1603, is both the bloodiest and most glorious chapter in samurai history. In this era of complete centralized authority, daimyos rose to power in every corner of Japan, acting like little kings. Each had a single dream: to march on Kyoto, seize control of the shogun, and become the master of all Japan. Being a samurai during this period meant bidding farewell to life every morning. A samurai's first act upon waking was to burn incense in his hair and inside his helmet before putting it on. Why? Because if he were to die in battle that day and his head were to be cut off as a prize by the enemy, he wanted it to smell pleasant, so as not to show disrespect even to his enemy. This period is the purest and most brutal form of Bushido, where death was paralyzed. But amidst this chaos, not only the sword, but also strategy evolved. Castles transformed from simple wooden structures into massive stone-walled engineering marvels.
At the beginning of the Sengoku Jidai, the balance of power constantly shifted. One day a hero could be betrayed by their closest ally the next. During this period, samurai were no longer merely mounted archers or swordsmen. They were now generals commanding vast armies, spies building intelligence networks, and bureaucrats managing the economy. Speaking of espionage, another mysterious force began to shine in the shadow of this chaos: the ninjas. These assassins, who carried out tasks unworthy of samurai honor from the shadows, became an integral part of the Sengoku period. Events intensified towards the middle of the 16th century. Japan was weary of these endless wars, but a glimmer of hope for unification was yet to appear. That is, until the first of the three great unifiers, a ruthless and brilliant leader, emerged on the historical stage. This leader would discard traditional samurai tactics, integrate firearms from the West into his army, and begin to unite Japan with an iron fist. Now, imagine the smoke rising from the castle towers on the horizon, and the fear of an enemy that could attack from anywhere at any moment. This century of chaos would either completely destroy Japan or give rise to a far stronger state from its ashes. For the samurai, the concept of service was now limited to serving only their own survival and the rise of their clans. But at the end of this dark age, the seeds of those great days when honor and order would be restored were being sown.
Move to Owari Prefecture in central Japan, a small and seemingly insignificant place in the mid-16th century. There, a young man, considered a fool by all, dressed strangely and defying tradition, lived Oda Nobunaga. Yet this young man was the first great unifier who would end a century of chaos in Japan. Nobunaga was the most ruthless leader the samurai world had ever seen. For him, absolute victory and efficiency mattered, not the romantic rules of Bushido. If a fortress did not fall by the sword, he would set it ablaze. If an enemy did not surrender, he would destroy them completely. Because of this ruthlessness, he was nicknamed Dai-Tenma, meaning Demon King of the Sixth Heaven. Nobunaga's genius lay not only in wielding a sword, but also in seeing the world change. In 1543, firearms, Tanegashima rifles, introduced to Japan by Portuguese merchants, were rejected by many samurai as dishonorable and cowardly. Samurai couldn't accept that this noisy weapon in the hands of a peasant could kill a warrior dedicated to sword training with a single shot. However, Nobunaga understood that this weapon was the future. He equipped his army with musket units composed of peasants and radically changed the samurai art of warfare. He was not just a warrior, but a revolutionary. Events gained momentum with the legendary Okehazama raid, where Nobunaga achieved the impossible. When he annihilated a massive army in the midst of a storm with a small number of soldiers, all of Japan began to tremble with fear at his name. Nobunaga's goal was clear: Tenka Fubu, meaning unifying the nation by military force. He crushed everything in his path. He did not hesitate to burn down powerful Buddhist monasteries that resisted him, along with the monks, women, and children inside. For him, religion or tradition could not stand in the way of unification. He wanted to dismantle the samurai order and establish a centralized state in its place.
Nobunaga was also a genius of modern economics and logistics. He built his fortresses not only for defense, but also as centers of trade. He initiated a free market economy and increased the speed of his army by securing roads. However, this speed and ruthlessness began to frighten even those closest to him. In Nobunaga's world, there was no room for error, and loyalty demanded absolute obedience. This tension was setting the stage for one of the greatest betrayals in Japanese history. Imagine the footsteps around Honnoji Shrine, Nobunaga's headquarters, in the darkness of night. The Demon King was very close to unifying Japan, but fate had other plans for him. One of his most trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, would attack his own master, shouting, "The enemy is at Honnoji." When Nobunaga, in the midst of the flames engulfing the temple, chose to end his life with seppuku rather than surrender, he left behind both a shattered old world and a blood-stained foundation ready for reunification. Tomorrow, we will discuss another legend who inherited this legacy from Nobunaga, a man who rose from peasant soldier to lord of the nation. The year is 1560. To understand how Japan's fate was turned upside down in a storm, let's go to the steep slopes of the Okehazama Valley. Igawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful warlords of the time, had set out for Kyoto, the seat of absolute power, with a massive army of 25,000 men. The only obstacle in his path was the young Oda Nobunaga, with only a few thousand soldiers. Everyone thought Nobunaga's end had come, that he should surrender. But in Nobunaga's mind, the most audacious raid plan in samurai history was taking shape.
Imagawa's army, complacent with their numerical superiority, had rested in a narrow valley called Okehazama, beginning to celebrate their victory. That day, the sky suddenly darkened, and a torrential downpour began. This storm was a blessing from the gods for Nobunaga. The thunderous rain and wind obscured the approaching footsteps of Nobunaga's small but elite unit. The samurai, their armor soaked and their swords gleaming, plunged like spears down the steep slopes into the heart of the celebrating and unprepared Imagawa army. Imagine that moment, lightning flashing, battle cries echoing through the valley, magnificent armor covered in mud, and thousands of soldiers suddenly stunned. Nobunaga's warriors charged directly into Imagawa Yoshimoto's tent. Yoshimoto, thinking the noise outside was a brawl, stepped out to find Oda's assassins. Within seconds, the head of one of Japan's most powerful men was severed from his body. Losing their leader, the 25,000-strong army was utterly routed by the attack of a few hundred samurai and began to flee. This victory was not merely a military triumph, it was the birth of a legend. Imagawa Yoshimoto sent a message to all of Japan. Numbers or noble blood no longer mattered. What mattered was strategy, speed, and determination. Nobunaga, with this raid, not only eliminated an enemy, but also shattered all the rules of the rest of the Sengoku period. He proved that a small clan, waiting for the right moment, could bring down a giant.
After this event, a new name would join Nobunaga's ranks. Kinoshita Tokichiro, a simple sandal carrier, but one whose intellect would shake the world. The future Toyotomi Hideyoshi. These steps, taken in the muddy valley of Okehazama, were the most critical turning point on the road to the unification of Japan. Now hear the sound of the rain and the sudden burst of war cries. History is sometimes rewritten in the midst of a storm. Imagine yourself in a squalid 16th-century Japanese village with a frail, scrawny boy running barefoot through the muddy streets. This boy came neither from a noble samurai family nor possessed the strength to wield a sword. His name wasn't yet Toyotomi Hideyoshi. At that time, he was simply a nobody. Yet this boy would become the only person in Japanese history to achieve the impossible, rising from a peasant to the absolute ruler, Kanpaku, of the entire country. Hideyoshi's story is proof of how even the rigid hierarchy of the samurai class bowed before genius. Hideyoshi entered Oda Nobunaga's army at the lowest rank as a sandal carrier. Legend has it that he caught his master's attention on a freezing winter day by warming Nobunaga's sandals against his chest. Nobunaga called him Saru, meaning monkey, because of his facial features. But this monkey possessed a sharper intellect than the army's best swordsman. He preferred winning wars not through bloodshed, but through logistics, bribery, and psychological warfare. He possessed an extraordinary engineering genius, capable of altering riverbeds to flood a fortress, as in the case of Tsunomata Castle, rather than besieging it for months. Events culminated in the betrayal and death of his master Nobunaga at Honnoji. Hideyoshi was on a distant campaign at the time. Upon receiving the news, he displayed the incredible speed that would go down in history as the Great Return to Chuai. Covering a distance that should have taken days in just hours, he captured and eliminated the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide. As the avenger of Nobunaga, he earned the right to inherit his master's legacy with his blood and speed. He was no longer a simple general of the Oda clan, but the new son of Japan. Hideyoshi's reign added a new dimension to the samurai spirit. He wasn't just a destroyer like Nobunaga. He knew how to turn his enemies into allies. He granted land to his defeated rivals, honored them, and secured their loyalty. The magnificent Jurakudai Palace and Osaka Castle he built in Kyoto were physical symbols of his power. But Hideyoshi never forgot where he came from. His peasant origins created both a complex and a desire to control society. One of his first major acts upon coming to power was to solidify class divisions so that ambitious peasants like himself could never rise again. Now imagine that man, who once wore sandals, now ruling all of Japan in silks in the gold-leafed rooms of Osaka Castle. He was not just a warrior, but a strategist. But as he reached the pinnacle of power, that power would slowly begin to poison him. Tomorrow, we will discuss how Hideyoshi froze society, how he turned the samurai into a closed box, and his infamous sword hunt operation. Get ready for an ironic and harsh story of how a villager collected weapons from other villagers.
Events culminated in the betrayal and death of his master, Nobunaga, at Honnoji. Hideyoshi was on a distant campaign at the time. Upon receiving the news, he displayed the incredible speed that would go down in history as the Great Return to Chigawaki. Covering a distance that should have taken days in just hours, he captured and eliminated the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide. As the avenger of Nobunaga, he earned the right to inherit his master's legacy with his blood and speed. He was no longer a simple general of the Oda clan, but the new son of Japan. Hideyoshi's reign added a new dimension to the samurai spirit. He wasn't just a destroyer like Nobunaga, he knew how to turn his enemies into allies. He granted land to his defeated rivals, honored them, and secured their loyalty. The magnificent Jurakudai Palace and Osaka Castle he built in Kyoto were physical symbols of his power. But Hideyoshi never forgot where he came from. His peasant origins created both a complex and a desire to control society. One of his first major acts upon coming to power was to solidify class divisions so that ambitious peasants like himself could never rise again. Now imagine that man who once wore sandals, now ruling all of Japan in silks in the gold-leafed rooms of Osaka Castle. He was not just a warrior, but a strategist. But as he reached the pinnacle of power, that power would slowly begin to poison him. Tomorrow we will discuss how Hideyoshi froze society, how he turned the samurai into a closed box, and his infamous sword hunt operation. Get ready for an ironic and harsh story of how a villager collected weapons from other villagers.
When Shingen died of illness, Kenshin would have been expected to rejoice, but he stopped eating and began to weep. "I have lost my best opponent, the other half that made me who I am," he said. This rivalry showed that the samurai spirit was not only about destruction, but also about rising together with one's opponent. They were each other's most relentless enemies, but also soulmates. With the deaths of Shingen and Kenshin, Japan's old romantic and feudal warrior era slowly began to close. Now hear the wind blowing through those snowy mountains and the rustling of Shingen's red banners. The mutual respect these two giants held for each other served as an example for samurai for centuries. But with the end of this noble era, only pragmatic leaders, burning with the ambition to unite, remained on the scene. Tomorrow we will go to Sekigahara, the colossal clash that will determine the ultimate end of this chaos, the battle where the fate of the world changed in a single day. Prepare for the greatest pitched battle in samurai history. On October 21, 1600, the heaviest fog Japan had ever seen descended upon the land. This was Sekigahara, a narrow pass nestled between mountains, a colossal scale where Japan's future would be weighed. On one side, the Western Army, led by Ishida Mitsunari, composed of those loyal to the Toyotomi clan. On the other, the Eastern Army, commanded by the ambitious and patient Tokugawa Ieyasu. In total, over 160,000 samurai stood in that narrow valley, each waiting for the other's breath. This was not just a battle, it was the final match of a century of Sengoku chaos.
At 8 o'clock in the morning, the fog suddenly lifted, revealing the horror of the battle. Gunfire echoed through the valley as samurai clashed in the muddy ground. But Sekigahara was not just a battle of swords, but also of secret agreements and betrayals. Before the battle began, Tokugawa Ieyasu had secretly sent letters to many daimyo on the opposing side, persuading them to switch allegiances. In the midst of the battle, a young leader named Kobayakawa Hideaki, waiting at the top of the valley, couldn't decide which side to attack. Ieyasu, impatient, ordered his cannons to fire on Kobayakawa's head, a warning to make a decision. Under this pressure, Kobayakawa attacked his own allies, the Western Army. This betrayal changed the course of the battle in seconds. Imagine the chaos, the moment when your comrade suddenly draws a sword against you and everything is covered in blood and gunpowder smoke. The Western Army was routed. Ishida Mitsunari escaped, but was captured and executed, not even allowed to die with the honor of a samurai. For Tokugawa Ieyasu, victory was absolute and certain. When the sun set that day, the lands of Sekigahara were drenched in the blood of 30,000 samurai, but Japan was now a single fist. Sekigahara was the golden shot of samurai warriorhood. This victory marked the beginning of a 250-year period of peace, the Edo Period. But this peace was strange for the warriors. What would a class whose life was solely dedicated to fighting do in a world where war had ended? Ieyasu's victory ignited a process that would transform the samurai from soldiers into bureaucrats. That savage energy of the battlefield would now be confined within laws, bureaucracy, and a rigid social hierarchy.
Close your eyes and hear the last gunshots from the misty valley of Sekigahara. One era ended, another began. Tomorrow we will explore how Tokugawa Ieyasu, the living legend of patience and strategy who orchestrated this victory, built peace and discover the glittering yet disciplined world of Edo. Carry your mind to an unshakable rock in the middle of a stormy sea. Oda Nobunaga had destroyed, Toyotomi Hideyoshi had built, but it would be Tokugawa Ieyasu who would transform the legacy of these two giants into an enduring empire.
There's a famous Japanese saying, "Nobunaga pounded the rice, Hideyoshi kneaded the dough, and Ieyasu ate the cake." While this might portray Ieyasu as a freeloader, it actually summarizes his greatest weapons, patience and a genius for timing. Ieyasu was a master strategist who waited in the shadows for decades, watching his powerful rivals destroy each other, waiting for the right moment. Ieyasu's life began with tragedies and hostages. He spent his childhood as a political hostage in the hands of rival clans and was forced to send his own wife and son to their deaths to protect his alliances. However, these sufferings transformed him not into a monster, but into a leader with the cold-blooded mind a samurai could possess, capable of completely controlling his emotions. He didn't see the samurai spirit as merely wielding a sword. For him, true samuraihood was about establishing a system that would rule a country forever. When he was declared shogun by the emperor in 1603, he moved the capital to Edo, a swampy fishing town that we know today as Tokyo.
The course of events changed with the Sankin Kotai forced residence system that Ieyasu established. Ieyasu devised a diabolical method to prevent the daimyo from rebelling against him. Each daimyo was obliged to live 1 year in Edo and 1 year in their own lands. They also left their families in Edo as guests, essentially hostages. This system caused the samurai to spend all their wealth on the road and in luxurious living in Edo. Thus, they had neither the money nor the time to wage war. Ieyasu imprisoned the samurai's wild energy within bureaucracy, ceremonies, and strict rules. Ieyasu's peace was like a golden cage for the samurai. He placed the samurai class at the top of society, but he brought them out of their barracks and into government offices. A samurai's success was no longer measured by how many heads he cut off, but by how good a ruler he was. When he died in 1616, he left behind one of the most stable military governments in the world. Like the Three Monkeys relief, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, at his tomb in Nikko Toshogu Shrine, the order he established was based on the absolute obedience of the people and the samurai. Now imagine the massive stone walls and silent gardens of Edo Castle. Ieyasu's patience changed Japan irrevocably. But within this peaceful yet oppressive order, the samurai spirit, born to fight, would slowly begin to transform. The swords were still at the waist, but now they gleamed more like ornaments. Tomorrow, in this age of peace, we will explore the story of the samurai's transformation from swordsman to penman, from warrior to bureaucrat, and the fascinating social structure of the Edo period.
When the peace of Tokugawa settled over Japan like a blanket, the samurai class entered the greatest identity crisis in its history. There was no longer a Mongol invasion or civil war on the horizon. During this period, which would last for nearly 2.5 centuries, samurai transformed into aging, salaried soldiers who never needed to draw their swords. Imagine the grandson of a warrior whose grandfather hunted heads on the bloody battlefield of Sekigahara, now keeping tax records in a government office, practicing calligraphy with a brush, or memorizing protocol rules. This was the samurai's domestication process. During the Edo period, society was divided into 4 distinct classes: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants. Samurai were at the top of this hierarchy, granted the kirisute gomen, the power to kill on the spot anyone from the common people who brought shame upon their honor. However, this power was so strictly limited by laws that it was almost never used. The samurai was no longer a war machine, but a paragon of morality to serve as an example to society. Bushido became even more romanticized during this period. It was no longer a battle strategy to be implemented, but rather a longing for the heroism of the past and an ethical guide. As events unfolded, economic balances began to shift.
With no war, the rice taxes, the samurai's main source of income, lost value against the rapidly enriching merchant class's money. Many samurai, despite their impoverishment, could not work due to their honor and were forced to pawn their swords. This created a profound rift in the samurai spirit. On one hand, there were high-ranking samurai strolling in palaces in silk robes. On the other, low-ranking warriors secretly making and selling umbrellas to make ends meet. Samurai status was no longer just a military skill, but a legal status and a way of life.
In these calm waters of the Edo period, samurai directed their intellectual energies towards art, philosophy, and education. The reason Japan's literacy rate was among the highest in the world at that time was that this unemployed warrior class transformed into teachers and scholars. They replaced the sharpness of the sword with the sharpness of the mind. But even amidst this tranquility, there were still those seeking the pure warrior path, spirits rebelling against this new bureaucratic order. Imagine the sound of a brush rustling across paper in the silence of the night, and a suit of armor hanging in a corner, now beginning to rust. The samurai spirit was not dead, it had simply fallen into a deep hibernation. Tomorrow, we will discuss Miyamoto Musashi, that legendary figure who, even in this age of peace, reminds us of what the way truly is, transforming the art of the sword into a philosophy. You will witness how an undefeated man became a legend in times of peace. Imagine yourself on the disciplined roads of the Edo period with a lone traveler, dust-covered, disheveled, but with eyes as sharp as a hawk carrying 2 swords at his waist. This man is Miyamoto Musashi. He was a Ronin, masterless samurai, who in an era when the samurai class had transformed into bureaucrats, continued to live the way of the warrior in its purest and most savage form. Musashi never lost a single one of the more than 60 duels he fought throughout his life. But his story is not just about beheading, it's about transforming the art of swordsmanship into a path to enlightenment.
The greatest turning point in Musashi's life was his duel in 1612 on Ganryu Island against Sasaki Kojiro, the most prestigious swordsman of the time. Kojiro was an aristocrat known for his timeless longsword, possessing impeccable technique. Musashi deliberately arrived late for the duel, irritating his opponent, and defeated Kojiro with a wooden sword he had carved from the oar of the boat he had used to travel to the island. This event taught the samurai world a lesson. War is not just about technique, but a game of mind and strategy. From that day on, Musashi rarely used a real sword, for in his view, a true master knew how to win without killing. The events deepened when Musashi retreated to the Reigondo cave in his final years. There, shortly before his death, he wrote Go-Rin no Sho, the Book of 5 Rings, considered the sacred text of samurai philosophy. In this book, he explains war using 5 elements: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. According to Musashi, strategy applies not only in war, but in every aspect of life. In the void section, he describes that state of absolute freedom, where the mind is not fixated on anything, but adapts to everything. He believed that a samurai should also be a painter, a sculptor, and a writer. Indeed, his ink paintings are among Japan's national treasures today. Musashi's legacy represents the individual perfection aspect of the samurai spirit. Although he served no master, he remained true to his own truth and discipline. His famous Niten Ichiryu, 2 heavens, 1 style, the art of wielding both the katana and the short sword simultaneously, is essentially an attempt to unite the 2 opposing poles of humanity, hardness and flexibility.
Musashi transformed samuraiism from a profession into an art form, a meditation.
Now imagine the coolness of that cave and the sound of Musashi's brush brushing against the paper. He was a guiding star, reminding us that even in peacetime, a warrior must remain vigilant. But alongside Musashi's individual wisdom, the samurai world was still poised to be shaken by its harshest and most tragic rule: collective loyalty and revenge. Tomorrow, the greatest, bloodiest, and most unforgettable epic of samurai honor, we are about to embark on the story of the 47 Ronin who risked their lives for their masters. In 1701, the strict protocol of Edo Castle triggered one of the greatest tragedies in Japanese history. The young Lord Asano Naganori drew his sword against the arrogant official Kira Yoshinaka, who had insulted him in the palace. Drawing a sword in the palace was an insult to the shogun's presence, punishable by death. Asano was executed by seppuku that same day, his clan was disbanded, and his 300 samurai were cast into the streets as Ronin, masterless warriors. However, 47 of these samurai, led by Oishi Kuranosuke, vowed the most planned and patient revenge in history. Events unfolded as a 2-year-long play. Oishi and his companions indulged in alcohol, gambling, and debauchery to deceive the shogun's spies. Oishi even allowed himself to be spat upon while lying drunk in a ditch, all to make his enemy, Kira, lose his composure. For a samurai, enduring such humiliation was far harder than death, yet their loyalty surpassed their own honor. On the night of December 14, 1702, amidst a heavy snowfall, 47 warriors silently surrounded Kira's estate.
Imagine that night, blood dripping onto the snow, the clash of steel shattering the silence, and 47 hearts burning with the fire of revenge. In a flawless operation, they captured Kira. They offered him a chance to die with honor, as their master had done, but when Kira, too afraid to respond, beheaded him, the mission was accomplished. After taking their revenge and offering Kira's head to their master's tomb, they all surrendered. All of Japan was captivated by this loyalty. The people regarded them as heroes, but the law was the law. The shogun granted them seppuku, allowing them to die with honor like samurai, rather than being hanged like criminals. The deaths of the 47 Ronin lined up side by side on the same day, disemboweling themselves, were the greatest explosion of the samurai spirit in the Edo period. They reminded the entire nation of the old, wild, and unwavering loyalty that the system tried to erase. Their graves are still in Tokyo at the Sengoku Shrine, and every year thousands visit to pay their respects to that unquenchable flame of loyalty. This event proved that Bushido was not just a war tactic, but an art of death. Now imagine the silence of that snowy night and the peace in the last breath of a vengeful warrior. The 47 Ronin wrote the last great epic of heroism in the samurai age. But behind this tragic end, the glittering nightlife of Edo and a completely different world rose, the floating world, ukiyo, of geishas and entertainment districts. Tomorrow, we will explore that colorful world where the samurai laid down his sword and embraced art and pleasure.
Imagine yourself in the late 18th century in Edo, Tokyo, in the famous Yoshiwara neighborhood, surrounded by moats and accessible through a single gate. This was the complete opposite of the samurai's rigid, hierarchical, and rule-bound world. Here, the ukiyo, or floating world, reigned supreme. While the term originated from the Buddhist philosophy that life is full of suffering and fleeting, for the people of Edo, it meant, since life is fleeting, savor the moment, go with the flow, and leave your worries behind. For a samurai, this neighborhood was the only escape from his rigid armor and heavy responsibilities. However, entering Yoshiwara wasn't easy for a samurai. The shogunate officially disapproved of the warrior class spending time there. Therefore, samurai concealed their faces by wearing large straw hats, amigasa, and handed over their sacred katanas, symbolizing their rank, to the guard at the door. Imagine that moment. The mighty warrior who bowed before the people in the streets during the day disappeared at night as an anonymous stranger amidst candlelight and the sounds of the shamisen. Here, money was mightier than the sword. The wealthy merchant class established the dominance they couldn't exert over the samurai in the most luxurious tea houses and alongside the most famous geishas.
The true stars of this floating world were the geishas. Contrary to a common misconception, geishas were not merely women who entertained. They were professionals representing the pinnacle of art, music, dance, and witty conversation. A samurai sought not only physical comfort, but also intellectual depth in the company of a geisha. Geishas were figures who could write poetry, discuss politics, and soothe a warrior's weary soul with song. This interaction introduced a new aesthetic to samurai culture. The samurai's brutal strength was tempered by the geisha's grace. Many samurai fell in love with geishas, sacrificing their honor and fortune for them. These impossible loves became the most beloved tragedies of the time, performed in puppet theaters, bunraku, and kabuki theaters. As events unfolded, this entertainment culture spread throughout the world through the famous woodblock prints called ukiyo-e. These prints immortalized the beauty of geishas, the exaggerated facial expressions of kabuki actors, and the secret adventures of samurai. However, this glittering world also heralded the decline of the samurai class. Created to fight, this class was becoming increasingly impoverished and dysfunctional in a world dominated by money and pleasure. When a samurai pawned his sword to pay a geisha's debt, he was essentially announcing the end of an era. Towards the end of the night, imagine a weary samurai emerging from Yoshiwara's gate. As the sun rises, he will put his straw hat back on and return to his disciplined, cold world. But in his mind, the strings of that khanas and the fleeting scent of the floating world still echo. This sweet dream will soon be shattered by the shadow of the black ships docking in the harbors. Tomorrow, we will discuss Japan's awakening from its 250-year slumber and how the steel giants of the West shook the samurai world to its foundations.
Imagine the morning of July 8, 1853, on the tranquil waters of Edo Bay, present-day Tokyo Bay. Japan, which for centuries had lived in near total isolation from the outside world, in its own inner peace and feudal order, was horrified by the sight on the horizon that morning. When the samurai guards on the shore saw the pitch-black smoke rising from the horizon, they initially thought colossal dragons were approaching. But what was approaching were 4 massive warships from the United States, commanded by Admiral Matthew Perry. These steam-powered monsters, which the Japanese called kurofune, or black ships, were made not only of steel, but also of a technology that heralded the end of the samurai world. Imagine that moment. Samurai on horseback, in their traditional armor and katanas, stood on the shore, gazing at these floating fortresses whose massive cannons could raze the city to the ground at any moment. Perry had come to dismantle Japan's infamous Sakoku policy of isolation, not through peaceful means, but through cannon diplomacy. He held the president's letter demanding that Japan open its ports to trade. For a samurai, this was not just a trade offer, but a stain on their honor. For centuries, the warrior class that had kept the barbarians away from their islands was facing for the first time a force that rendered their swords utterly useless. The samurai tried to approach the ships in small boats, but they were like ants beside that enormous hull.
The events created a climate of complete panic within the shogunate. On one side were the conservative samurai who proclaimed Sono Joi, glorify the emperor, drive out the barbarians, and on the other were those who saw the power of the West and realized that modernization was the only option. When Perry left, giving the Japanese a year to think, Japan was no longer the old Japan. The famous bond of loyalty among the samurai had begun to crack. As the shogunate bowed to foreigners, lower-ranking samurai, especially the Satsuma and Choshu clans, lost faith in their own government. For them, this was a violation of the principle of protecting the homeland, the greatest rule of Bushido. During this period, the streets of Japan were filled with young and radical samurai called shishi, men of high ideals. These samurai challenged Westerners to duels in the streets and caused disturbances in the ports. However, each conflict proved once again how weak the sword was against the bullet. The black ships had forcibly opened not only the ports, but also the gates of the Japanese spirit. Steam power was putting the samurai's spiritual strength to the test. Now, not only swordsmanship, but also world politics and modern technology had become the criteria for the samurai's survival. Imagine the lights of those giant ships anchored in Edo Bay in the darkness of the night, and the desperate rage of a samurai clenching his sword on the shore. The 250-year-old Tokugawa peace was darkened by the coal smoke rising from the chimneys of these ships. The samurai class would either perish in this new world order or completely destroy itself, giving birth to a modern nation from its ashes. Tomorrow, we will discuss the bloody and honorable story of the Shinsengumi, the last and most loyal guards of the shogunate, who tried to maintain order amidst this chaos.
History sometimes writes its most beautiful pages through the heroism of the losers. Kyoto in the 1860s was a powder keg of political assassinations, dynastic feuds, and anti-Western rebellions. Amidst this chaos, a group was formed, sworn to loyalty to the shogunate until their last breath, composed mostly of masterless samurai, ronin, and even peasant warriors, the Shinsengumi, newly chosen group. They would be known as the Wolves of Kyoto, their famous light blue Hiyori jackets with white zigzag trimmings delivering justice with the tips of their swords. The Shinsengumi's rules were based on the strictest and most ruthless interpretation of Bushido. The group's leader, Kondo Isami, and master of discipline, Hijikata Toshizo, had written the Warrior's Code, Kyokuchu Hato. According to these laws, a member leaving the group, accepting money without permission, or deserting from battle was punishable by only one act, seppuku. More than half of those who died within the Shinsengumi were killed not by enemies, but by their own comrades, due to the strict rules of the regime. Imagine, on one side, the cherry blossom-covered streets of Kyoto, and on the other, the heavy footsteps of the guards who washed those streets with blood every night. The culmination of these events was the Iketeya incident of 1864. Shinsengumi spies uncovered a plan by rebel samurai to set Kyoto ablaze and kidnap the shogun's representative. One summer night, Kondo Isami and a handful of loyal warriors raided the Iketeya Inn where the rebels had gathered. Hours of relentless sword fighting ensued in the narrow corridors and candlelit rooms. The raid was successful, and the Shinsengumi became legendary overnight. However, this victory would not be enough to save a crumbling system. The course of history was rapidly shifting from the old order, represented by the Shinsengumi, towards modernity. The members of the Shinsengumi were not only warriors, but also tragic romantics. In an era when everyone was defecting, abandoning the shogun, and seeking refuge in the new imperial government, they were the last embodiments of the samurai ideal of fighting even knowing defeat.
When their leader, Kondo, was captured and executed, Hijikata Toshizo retreated north to Hokkaido, resisting modern cannons and rifles with his sword until the very end. His final words summarize the end of an era. "My body may rot on Azo Island, but my soul will continue to protect my lord in the east." Now imagine the harsh sound of slippers echoing through the streets of Kyoto and the Shinsengumi's famous Makoto, loyalty banner, fluttering in the wind. They were at the forefront of that desperate yet epic battle of sword against rifle. Tomorrow, we will discuss how this bloody process transformed into a social revolution, how the Meiji Restoration legally ended the samurai order and the infamous ban on swords. Transport your mind to Kyoto in 1868, to those chaotic days when gunpowder smoke and winds of change enveloped the city. The 700-year-old shogunate regime had collapsed, and power had been transferred to the young Emperor Meiji, who was no longer a symbolic figure. But this was not just a change of power, it was Japan's leap from the Middle Ages into the modern world. In this new order, the samurai, ironically, would become the first victims of the revolution they themselves had initiated. For the new government, which sought to build a modern state, the samurai class was now nothing more than an expensive and outdated caste system, the greatest obstacle to progress.
Events accelerated with a series of laws targeting the spirit of the samurai. First, in 1871, the feudal land system was abolished. Haihon Chiken, that is, the samurai's ties to their lords and lands, were severed. But the real blow came in 1876, Hai Torei, the prohibition of carrying swords. Imagine that moment. For a samurai, his sword was half of his soul. Those two swords, daisho, which for centuries commanded the public to step aside respectfully as they walked down the street, were now illegal. Warriors who had once been lords were now stopped by police, and the sacred steel at their waists confiscated. This was the loss of not only weapons, but also honor and social standing for a class. The government didn't stop there. State salaries for samurai were cut, and they were told to work like ordinary citizens. Hands once obligated to fight and philosophize were now forced to make shoes, sell vegetables in the market, or work in tea plantations. Even the famous chanmage style of hair was forbidden. Short Western-style hair was mandatory. Many samurai tried to adapt to this change. Some became officers in the modern army, others successful businessmen. But for the vast majority, this new world was dishonored and alien. During this process, Japan resembled a giant construction site. Factories were being built, railways laid, and a modern education system constructed with teachers from the West. The abolition of the samurai class was a necessary sacrifice to liberate Japan from colonial rule, but like any operation, it brought great turmoil. At night, thousands of angry men, still secretly carrying their katanas and ready to give their lives for the honor of the old days, roamed the dark streets. This anger would soon transform into the greatest and most tragic samurai revolt history had ever seen. Now imagine those rusty swords, wrapped in silk and hidden in attics in those silent houses. The samurai were no longer legally extinct, but their spirit still lived in that steel. Tomorrow, we will discuss the final great cry of that spirit, the epic and tragic rebellion of the last samurai, Saigo Takamori, who marched with his sword against the modern army. The year is 1877. Japan's pangs of modernization ignited into a massive fire in the mountains of Kyushu. Ironically, at the head of this rebellion was Saigo Takamori, a giant and compassionate leader who was one of the greatest architects of the Meiji Restoration.
Saigo had initially supported modernization, but he could no longer tolerate the blatant disregard for the honor of the samurai class and the selling of Japan's soul to the West. He was now a rebel, but in the eyes of the people, he was the last living embodiment of samurai virtue. Events erupted as thousands of unemployed and angry samurai gathered around Saigo marched against the central government. This was the scene of one of history's most striking contrasts. On one side, samurai representing the old world with their traditional armor, katanas, and bows. On the other, the modern Japanese army, built by Saigo himself, with its telegraph lines, modern cannons, and rifles. The samurai charged at machine guns with drawn swords. They were few in number, their technology was backward, but in the heart of each of them lay the accumulated honor of centuries. The rebellion reached its final destination at Shiroyama Hill. Saigo was left with only a few hundred loyal warriors. Facing them was a modern army of 30,000. On the morning of September 24th, as the modern army bombarded the hill with artillery fire, the samurai launched a final assault, Banzai. Severely wounded, Saigo, in a manner befitting a samurai, ended his life by seppuku with the support of his assistant. With his death, the samurai class was completely erased from world history as a military force. The sword had been defeated by the bullet, but Saigo's unwavering stance made him an eternal hero for the Japanese people. The end of this rebellion marked the definitive burial of the Middle Ages in Japan. The samurai were gone, but even the government was forced to restore Saigo's honor after his death. They understood that without the values of loyalty and honesty that it represented, modern Japan could not survive. Samuraiism had physically ended, but its spiritual legacy was poised to permeate the veins of the modern Japanese army and society.
Transport your mind to a Japan at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, where factories with smoking chimneys and Western-style buildings rose. The samurai class had legally become a thing of the past. Carrying swords was forbidden, and the old feudal lords had lost their titles. But a 1,000-year-old discipline couldn't disappear overnight. As Japan moved with the principle of the spirit of the East, the technology of the West, it repackaged the samurai's famous ethical values, Bushido, to create a modern national identity. Now, loyalty was a sacred duty offered not only to a lord, but to the emperor and the Japanese state. During this period, samurai ethics became a guide not only for soldiers, but also for students, workers, and bureaucrats. While bloody rituals like seppuku, harakiri, were physically forbidden, the samurai's understanding of taking responsibility and paying the price with honor when one makes a mistake became ingrained in modern Japanese business culture. Imagine a factory manager or a government official worked with the unwavering discipline inherited from their samurai ancestors. The absolute focus of samurai sword training was now channeled into modern scientific and industrial advancements. This transformed warrior spirit was the true driving force behind Japan's incredibly rapid development.
Events reached an international level in 1900 with Inazo Nitobe's book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan. With this book, Nitobe introduced samurai to the Western world as Japanese chivalry. The samurai was no longer a barbarian, he was a gentleman embodying honesty, courage, kindness, and loyalty. This romanticized image of the samurai evolved into the Banzai spirit within the Japanese army. However, there was a dark side to this. The samurai's fearlessness in the face of death became the primary motivation for kamikaze pilots and suicide attacks during World War II. The samurai spirit became both an inspiration and a tragic instrument within modern nationalism. Even after the devastation of war, the samurai ethic did not disappear. During Japan's rebirth in the 1950s and 60s, corporate warriors, salaryman, emerged. These modern samurai carried bags instead of swords, demonstrating their loyalty to their companies, much like the old samurai's loyalty to their masters. Dying from overwork, karoshi, was a modern and melancholic reflection of the samurai's ideal of giving one's life for duty. The samurai spirit was transformed from the sword into a work discipline, a code of social etiquette, and an unwavering philosophy of patience. Now, imagine a man in a suit bowing to another with deep respect under the neon lights of modern Tokyo. Within that bow lies the court protocol and samurai courtesy of centuries past. Samurai spirit is no longer a class, but the collective consciousness of Japan. Tomorrow, in the final episode of our series, we'll discuss how this timeless legacy lives on around the world today, still influencing modern people in everything from cinema and sports to business and personal development.
In the final installment of our series, we transcend time and look at the present, at our own world. Samurai may have physically perished on Shiroyama Hill, but their legacy has transcended the borders of Japan, becoming a global source of inspiration. Today, a manager reads Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings while formulating strategy. An athlete clears their mind with Zen before a competition, and an artist draws inspiration from the samurai's minimalist and sharp aesthetic. The samurai spirit is no longer just a memory in history books, but the way modern man wages his own war. Popular culture has immortalized the samurai. From Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai to George Lucas's Jedi Knights in Star Wars, the samurai figure has become a universal symbol of justice, solitude, and supreme discipline. Imagine, today, in dojos or training halls around the world, people practicing kendo or aikido are not just learning physical techniques, they breathe the ancient samurai virtues, self-control, and respect for the opponent. For a samurai, the sword was a tool of destruction, but also a path to self-discovery. Even in the modern world, the samurai spirit continues to represent serenity amidst chaos and individual integrity within the crowd. At the end of this 30-episode journey, we understand that being a samurai is actually not a title, but a way of being. From its origins, Heian period, through the great clan wars, Genpei, from a century of chaos, Sengoku, to great peace, Edo, and finally to its demise in modern times, the samurai taught us to push the boundaries of human limits, to prioritize honor above life, and the importance of having a path no matter what. The samurai spirit is no longer just a memory in history books, but the way modern man wages his own war.
Now close your eyes and imagine all the heroes of this long story. Shingen's unwavering stance like the mountains, Musashi's silence in his cave, the loyalty of the 47 Ronin beneath the snow, and Saigo Takamori's final gaze. They all shine in your mind like stars. They are no longer just history. They are a part of your inner discipline, your inner honor, and your own personal journey, which you begin anew each day. This sun rising from the misty mountains of Japan does not set in your mind. On the contrary, as you begin each new day, it reminds you of that ancient samurai whisper. The path is hidden in your footsteps. Walk with honor. This epic from the land where the sun rises ends here, but the samurai spirit will continue to live on in your resolve. May you sleep peacefully and with honor.